The fluorescent lights of Goodwill cast everything in an unflattering yellow glow, but Maya Chen had learned to see past the harsh lighting years ago. She moved through the racks with practiced efficiency, her fingers automatically sorting through polyester blends and fast fashion casualties until they found something that made her pause. After 4 years of hunting through thrift stores across New York's 5 boroughs, Maya had developed what her roommate called fashion radar, an almost supernatural ability to spot quality pieces hidden among the debris of other people's closet purges. Today felt different, though. Maya had been searching for something special, something that could carry her through the Fashion Futures Gala next week. Her student budget of roughly -$50 meant designer retail was out of the question, but Maya had long ago learned that the best fashion stories weren't about price tags. They were about vision, creativity, and the ability to see potential where others saw only problems. The dress was buried between a stained wedding gown that reeked of mothballs and a collection of outdated blazers with shoulder pads aggressive enough to use as weapons. At first glance, it looked like nothing special. A simple black sheath with an unusual neckline, and what appeared to be water damage along the hem. The fabric was wrinkled beyond recognition, and there was a musty smell that suggested it had been sitting in someone's basement for years. But Maya's eye, trained by 4 years at Parsons School of Design and countless hours studying vintage Vogue archives in the library, caught something others would miss. The cut was too precise for contemporary fast fashion. The proportions were wrong for anything mass-produced. The sleeves were a half-inch too long in exactly the way that suggested intentional design rather than poor manufacturing. The fabric, despite its rumpled state, had a weight and drape that spoke of quality wool crepe, the kind of material that cost hundreds of dollars per yard. And that neckline, asymmetrical, with a subtle architectural fold that created a cowl effect on one side while remaining clean and minimal on the other, was distinctly avant-garde. Maya had seen similar techniques in museum exhibitions on deconstructionist fashion. She pulled the dress from the rack with trembling hands, her heart racing as she examined the label with the intensity of an archaeologist discovering ancient artifacts. There, printed in simple sans serif font on a black cotton label, were the words that made her knees weak: Comme des garçons. Maya's mind raced through fashion history timelines. Rei Kawakubo's revolutionary approach to fashion in the 1980s and 90s, the way she had challenged Western beauty standards and conventional silhouettes, the museum retrospectives that had elevated her work to fine art status. This wasn't just a dress, it was a piece of fashion history. $15, Maya whispered to herself, checking the price tag twice to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. She'd seen similar pieces from Kawakubo's archive collections sell for thousands at auction houses like Christie's and Sotheby's. Vintage fashion dealers in Soho would price this piece in the mid-four figures minimum. But the dress needed serious work. The hem was indeed water-stained, with brown marks that suggested flood damage or a basement leak. There was a small but noticeable tear near the left armpit, probably from improper storage. The fabric had that distinctive musty smell that clung to thrift store finds, a mixture of dust, old perfume, and time itself. The architectural folds that made the piece so special were completely collapsed, making it look like a shapeless black sack. Maya didn't care. She'd become an expert at restoration over her years of thrift shopping, partly out of necessity and partly out of love for the craft of fashion. Her parents had taught her that everything could be fixed with enough patience and skill. Growing up as the daughter of immigrants who ran a small alteration shop in Flushing, Queens, Maya had learned to sew before she could properly hold a pencil. Her earliest memories involved sitting cross-legged on the floor of Chen's alterations, surrounded by fabric scraps and watching her mother's hands work magic on garments that seemed beyond repair. Her father would explain the construction of different garments as he worked, teaching Maya to read the language of seams, darts, and pattern pieces. Clothes tell stories, her father had always said in his careful English. Good clothes tell good stories. Our job is to help them tell their stories properly. Her parents, practical people who had sacrificed everything to build a new life in America, viewed Maya's fashion obsession with bemused tolerance rather than enthusiasm. They had hoped she'd pursue something more stable than fashion design. Accounting, perhaps, or nursing. Something with a clear path to financial security and respectability. But Maya's passion burned too bright to contain, fueled by late nights sketching designs by lamplight and dreams of seeing her work on international runways. When she'd been accepted to Parsons with a partial scholarship, her parents had been proud but worried. Fashion, they knew, was a business built on connections and capital, two things their family lacked. Now, in her final semester at Parsons, Maya was drowning in student debt while her classmates flaunted their designer wardrobes and family connections to industry insiders. She made do with thrift store finds, careful alterations, and her own designs sewn late into the night on her grandmother's vintage Singer machine, the same machine her mother had used to build their alterations business. Maya paid for the dress with crumpled bills and loose change, the cashier barely glancing at the piece that had just become the most expensive item in Maya's wardrobe. She took the subway back to Brooklyn, clutching the garment bag like it contained the crown jewels. Back in her tiny studio apartment, a generous term for what was essentially a bedroom with a kitchenette in a converted warehouse, Maya spread the Comme des Garçons dress across her cutting table. Under proper lighting, its genius became even more apparent. The architectural folds weren't decorative, they were functional, creating a silhouette that was both avant-garde and incredibly flattering. The asymmetrical neckline would highlight collarbones while the structured draping would create the illusion of height and elegance. Rei Kawakubo's vision, even decades old, remained revolutionary. This was fashion as art, clothing as sculpture, the kind of intellectual approach to design that had inspired Maya to pursue fashion in the first place. Maya spent the next 3 days researching the piece. She cross-referenced design details with archived fashion magazines, identifying it as likely being from Kawakubo's 1998 fall-winter collection, a particularly experimental period when the designer was exploring the relationship between Eastern and Western approaches to garment construction. The water damage was disappointing but not surprising. Improper storage had destroyed countless vintage pieces over the years. The restoration process began on a Thursday evening after Maya finished her last class of the week. She cleared her entire apartment, transforming it into a makeshift conservation studio. Every surface was covered with white cotton fabric to protect the dress from contamination. She documented every flaw with her phone camera, creating a before and after record that would prove useful later. The water stains required delicate chemistry. Maya had learned stain removal techniques from Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who ran a vintage clothing store in the village and had become an informal mentor. The process involved creating a solution of distilled water, white vinegar, and a tiny amount of conservation-grade detergent. Each stain had to be treated individually, with Maya using cotton swabs to apply the solution in careful circular motions. The work was painstaking. Maya spent 6 hours on the first day just on the hem, testing different concentrations of her cleaning solution on hidden seam allowances to ensure the fabric's integrity wouldn't be compromised. The wool crepe was delicate, and one wrong move could destroy the piece entirely. The tear near the armpit presented a different challenge. Maya had to carefully deconstruct part of the side seam to access the damaged area properly. Using thread that she'd hand-dyed to match the dress's particular shade of black, not just any black, but the specific charcoal-tinged black that Kawakubo favored, Maya spent an entire evening doing hand-stitching that was invisible to the naked eye. Invisible mending is the highest form of tailoring skill, her father had taught her. Anyone can make new. Only masters can make broken things whole again. The hardest part was resisting the urge to alter the design. Maya's instinct, as a young designer, was to add her own touches, to improve what she saw as minor flaws in the original construction. But she recognized that the dress's value lay in its authenticity as a Kawakubo piece. Her job was to restore, not to redesign. Instead, she focused on perfect restoration, treating the piece like the work of art it was. She researched historical pressing techniques to ensure the architectural folds would hold their shape properly. She found a specialty dry cleaner in Manhattan who worked with museum pieces and had them do a final cleaning that removed the last traces of musty odor. When she finally tried on the completed dress, Maya barely recognized herself in the full-length mirror she'd borrowed from her roommate Zoe. The garment transformed her petite frame, creating bold, geometric lines that made her look taller, more confident, more striking. The asymmetrical neckline highlighted her collarbones and created an elegant line down her neck. The structured draping disguised what Maya had always considered her too small bust and too wide hips, creating a silhouette that was both distinctly feminine and powerfully architectural. It was exactly the kind of piece she dreamed of wearing to industry events, if she could ever afford to attend them. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Maya was sitting in her advanced pattern making class, half listening to Professor Williams drone about French curve techniques, when her phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, no relation to the senator, as she constantly reminded people with increasing irritation. Dr. Warren was Maya's thesis advisor, a former Vogue editor who had transitioned into academia after what she vaguely referred to as creative differences with Anna Wintour. She was brilliant, demanding, and had connections throughout the fashion industry that she guarded like state secrets. Miss Chen, the email read, I wanted to inform you the Fashion Futures Gala has opened a limited number of student tickets. This is the most important networking event of the year, attended by editors, buyers, and industry executives. However, tickets are $200 each and must be purchased by Friday. I thought you might be interested. Maya stared at the email, her heart sinking. $200 might as well have been $2,000. Her last paycheck from her part-time job at a coffee shop in the village had gone entirely to rent, and her meal plan for the week consisted of ramen noodles and whatever free food she could find at campus events. She was resigned to missing another opportunity when her roommate Zoe casually mentioned the gala over dinner. I bought a ticket months ago, Zoe said, twirling organic pasta around her fork. Zoe was a photography student whose trust fund allowed her to pursue art without worrying about mundane concerns like money. But I just found out there's a family thing in the Hamptons that weekend. Some cousin's engagement party that I absolutely cannot miss, according to my mother. Maya made sympathetic noises while internally calculating whether she could afford to eat anything besides ramen for the next month if Zoe offered to sell her the ticket at cost. You should totally take my place, Zoe continued, not looking up from her laptop where she was editing photos from a recent shoot. Consider it payment for all the times you've helped me with my fashion photography assignments. Plus, you actually care about this stuff. I was only going for the free champagne and networking opportunities. Maya stared at the ticket Zoe casually handed her, her heart pounding so hard she was sure her roommate could hear it. This was her chance to network with industry professionals, to make the connections that could transform her career from pipe dream to reality. The Fashion Futures Gala was legendary in fashion circles. Careers had been launched over conversations by the bar, collaborations formed over shared desserts. Are you sure? Maya asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Absolutely. Besides, Zoe grinned, if you make it big, I want to be able to say I knew you when. Just promise you'll remember the little people when you're designing for celebrities. Maya spent the days leading up to the gala in a state of controlled panic. She researched every confirmed attendee, studying their backgrounds and recent projects. She prepared elevator pitches for her thesis collection and rehearsed responses to potential questions about her design philosophy. She even practiced walking in the heels she'd borrowed from another classmate, determined not to embarrass herself in front of industry legends. The Fashion Futures Gala was held at the Metropolitan Club, a limestone mansion on the Upper East Side that reeked of old money and older traditions. The building had been designed in the 1890s as a private club for wealthy New Yorkers and still maintained an atmosphere of exclusivity that made Maya feel like an intruder. As Maya approached the entrance, she was struck by the sheer opulence of her surroundings. The facade was covered in carved limestone details that probably cost more than her annual tuition. Uniformed doormen stood at attention, opening doors for guests who arrived in black cars that cost more than most people's houses. Maya had taken the subway, emerging from the nearest station with her carefully preserved composure intact and her vintage Comme des Garçons dress hidden under a borrowed coat. She felt like Cinderella approaching the ball, except she'd made her own magic happen through skill and determination, rather than fairy godmother intervention. Inside, the club was even more intimidating. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across marble floors that reflected the carefully curated outfits of fashion's elite. Every surface seemed to gleam with careful attention, from the gilt-framed portraits of long-dead robber barons to the polished brass fixtures that probably required a full-time staff to maintain. As Maya checked her coat, she noticed the other attendees, fashion editors and cutting-edge designer pieces that probably cost more than her semester's tuition. Emerging designers wearing their own creations like armor, industry veterans whose faces she recognized from magazines and whose approval could make or break careers. Everyone looked expensive, polished, perfectly curated. Even the waitstaff seemed to have been selected for their aesthetic appeal, moving through the crowd with choreographed precision, as they offered champagne and canapes that were probably prepared by celebrity chefs. Maya smoothed her vintage Comme des Garçons dress and reminded herself that she belonged here. Her professors had consistently praised her work, calling it innovative and sophisticated. Her thesis collection was generating buzz among faculty, with Dr. Warren hinting that she might arrange for industry professionals to attend Maya's final presentation. She had every right to be in this room. The evening started well. Maya positioned herself strategically near the bar, nursing a single glass of wine she couldn't really afford, and struck up conversations with other young designers who seemed as overwhelmed by the grandeur as she was. Several people complimented her dress, with one vintage fashion dealer asking detailed questions about its provenance and restoration. "The workmanship on that repair is museum quality," the dealer said, examining the formerly torn armpit area with professional interest. "You did this yourself? That's incredibly impressive. Most people would have butchered a piece this significant." Maya found herself in stimulating discussions about sustainable fashion, the ethics of fast fashion, and the future of the industry. She exchanged business cards with a buyer from Barney's, discussed internship opportunities with an editor from Harper's Bazaar, and even managed to have a brief but encouraging conversation with a designer whose work she'd admired since high school. For the first time since arriving at Parsons, Maya felt like she was exactly where she belonged. This was her world, her people, her future spreading out before her like a red carpet. Then she spotted them. Across the room, holding court near the grand staircase like royalty at their own coronation, stood the Trinity. That's what everyone called them, though never to their faces. Madison Blackwell, whose family owned a chain of luxury boutiques across the Northeast. Sebastian Harding, heir to a textile fortune that traced back to the Industrial Revolution. And Vivienne Dupont, whose trust fund was legendary even by New York fashion school standards. They were the golden children of Parsons, the ones professors favored not so subtly, the ones who landed coveted internships at major fashion houses through family connections, the ones whose thesis shows were attended by Anna Wintour herself because their parents played tennis with Condé Nast executives. Maya had spent 4 years watching them from the sidelines, knowing her talent was equal to, if not greater than theirs, but lacking the connections and capital that opened doors in the fashion industry. They treated fashion school like an expensive hobby, a way to pass time before inheriting their family's businesses or marrying into even more wealth. Madison spotted Maya first. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows, no doubt maintained by the best esthetician money could buy, rose as she whispered something to her companions, and all three turned to stare with the predatory interest of sharks scenting blood in the water. Maya felt her carefully constructed confidence begin to waver under their scrutiny, but she held her ground, lifting her chin defiantly and taking a sip of her wine with what she hoped looked like casual confidence. "Oh my God!" Madison's voice carried across the room, pitched just loud enough to be overheard by nearby groups, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if confronted. "Is that Maya Chen in a thrift store dress?" The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Around her, conversations quieted as heads turned to see what was happening. Maya's carefully constructed confidence began to crumble as dozens of eyes focused on her, evaluating her outfit with the ruthless efficiency of fashion insiders. Sebastian laughed, a sound like expensive crystal breaking on marble floors. How authentic. Very committed to the whole struggling artist aesthetic. I admire the dedication to character. "I heard she shops at Goodwill," Vivian added, her voice dripping with false sympathy that fooled absolutely no one. "It's so brave how she makes do with other people's cast-offs. Very resourceful." The crowd was watching now, waiting to see how this social execution would play out. Maya felt frozen. Every insecurity she'd ever had about her background, her lack of money, her outsider status crashing over her like a tsunami of self-doubt. She thought about her parents working 14-hour days in their alterations shop to pay for her education. About the nights she'd stayed up until dawn sewing her own clothes because she couldn't afford the designer pieces her classmates wore like uniforms. about every time she'd felt like an imposter in this glittering world of wealth and privilege. Although, Madison continued, circling closer like a predator who had sensed weakness, I have to admire the commitment to sustainability. Very on trend. Though I suppose when you can't afford actual fashion, recycling becomes a necessity rather than a choice. More laughter rippled through the surrounding group. Maya's face burned with humiliation, but beneath the embarrassment, anger began to build like pressure in a steam engine. These people, with their unlimited budgets and family connections, had no idea what real creativity looked like. They'd never had to transform a $15 thrift store find into something extraordinary. They'd never had to prove their worth through skill alone. It's vintage comme des garçons, Maya said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The laughter faltered slightly. Madison's eyes narrowed as she processed this information, trying to determine if Maya was lying or if she'd somehow stumbled onto something valuable. Sure it is, Sebastian smirked, but there was less certainty in his voice now. And I suppose next you'll tell us it's from an important collection? Maybe you found it in Anna Wintour's personal donation bag. 1998 fall-winter, Maya replied, louder now, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet section of the room. Rei Kawakubo's exploration of architectural draping techniques. This particular piece was featured in Vogue's retrospective on deconstructionist fashion 3 years ago. The mockery in Madison's eyes flickered for just a moment, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. She was clearly trying to determine whether Maya was telling the truth or simply had memorized enough fashion history to sound convincing. But she recovered quickly, her smile returning with renewed venom. How convenient that you have such detailed knowledge of something you supposedly found in a thrift store, she said. Though I suppose anyone can memorize fashion history. Having an encyclopedic knowledge of vintage pieces doesn't actually make your outfit any less tragic. Around them, the crowd began to lose interest as the drama failed to escalate into the kind of spectacular social destruction they'd been hoping for. Conversations resumed, but Maya could feel eyes still on her, whispers still following her as she became the evening's entertainment. The damage was done. Maya felt exposed, diminished, her carefully rebuilt confidence in tatters around her feet like fabric scraps on a cutting room floor. She excused herself and found refuge in the ladies' room, a marble and gold confection that probably cost more to renovate than most people's houses. Maya stared at her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror, trying to process what had just happened. The dress that had made her feel so powerful now felt like a costume, a pretense she couldn't maintain in the face of their casual cruelty. But as she studied her reflection, something shifted inside her. The anger that had been building crystallized into something more useful, determination. Maya pulled out her phone and positioned herself in front of the ornate mirror. The lighting in the bathroom was actually perfect, the warm glow of the sconces creating dramatic shadows that highlighted the architectural lines of the dress. She took several photos, adjusting angles until she captured the piece's true beauty. The image she finally selected showed her from the waist up, the asymmetrical neckline creating an elegant diagonal line across the frame. The architectural folds cast intriguing shadows, and the vintage quality of the piece was evident in every carefully restored detail. She posted the image to her Instagram account, Maya Stitches, which had a modest following of fellow fashion students, vintage enthusiasts, and a few industry professionals who had discovered her work through her professor's recommendations. Her caption was simple but pointed. When they laugh at your thrift store finds, but you're wearing 1998 Comme des Garçons. The best fashion has always been about vision, not price tags. #thrift finds, #vintage, #Comades Garçons, #sustainable fashion, #fashion history, #Rei Kawakubo, #vintage Vogue. Maya didn't expect much response. Her posts usually garnered a few dozen likes from friends and classmates, maybe a comment or two from other fashion students. But as she returned to the gala, trying to salvage what remained of the evening and her wounded pride, something unexpected was happening on her phone. The post was gaining traction. Not just likes, but comments from people she didn't recognize. Vintage fashion enthusiasts were identifying the specific collection and praising her restoration work. Sustainable fashion advocates were sharing the post with their own followers, adding commentary about the environmental impact of fast fashion. Fashion history students were engaging in detailed discussions about Kawakubo's techniques and influence. "This is incredible restoration work," wrote at Vintage Fashionista, an account Maya had followed for years but never expected to notice her work. "The fact that you rescued this piece and brought it back to its original glory is exactly what sustainable fashion should be about." "Ray would be proud," commented at deconstructed_fashion, an account run by a fashion theory professor at FIT. "This is how you honor fashion history, through understanding, skill, and respect for the original vision." More comments poured in. Professional costume designers praising her technique. Museum conservators asking about her restoration methods. Young designers inspired by her approach to sustainable fashion. By the time Maya returned to her apartment that night, leaving the gala early after the confrontation had soured the entire evening, the post had been shared hundreds of times. Her follower count had doubled, then tripled. Fashion bloggers were reaching out for interviews. A vintage clothing dealer in Los Angeles wanted to know if she did restoration work for clients. But the real surprise came 3 days later. Maya was sitting in her History of Fashion Design class, half listening to a lecture on the influence of Japanese designers on Western fashion. Ironic, considering recent events, when her phone buzzed with a DM notification. She glanced at the screen casually, expecting another message from a fellow fashion student or vintage enthusiast. Instead, her heart nearly stopped. The message was from Vogue magazine, the actual official Vogue Instagram account with its distinctive blue verification checkmark and millions of followers. Maya's hands shook as she opened the message, certain it must be some kind of mistake or spam account with a similar name. "Hi Maya, we love your recent post about the vintage Comme des Garçons piece. Your restoration work is incredible, and your approach to sustainable fashion aligns perfectly with a feature we're developing. Would you be interested in speaking with our digital team about your work? Please DM us your contact information if you're available for a call this week." Maya read the message 3 times, each time convinced the words would rearrange themselves into something less impossible. Vogue, the fashion Bible, the ultimate authority. The magazine that could make or break careers with a single mention. They wanted to talk to her. She had to excuse herself from class, claiming sudden illness, and spent the next hour in a campus bathroom stall hyperventilating and trying to compose a response that didn't sound like the incoherent rambling of a starstruck fashion student. Her final response was carefully crafted. "Thank you so much for reaching out. I would be honored to speak with your team about my work in sustainable fashion and vintage restoration. I'm available anytime this week that works for your schedule." The phone call was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Maya spent the intervening days in a state of barely controlled panic, researching every member of Vogue's digital team and preparing talking points about her philosophy, her techniques, and her vision for sustainable fashion. The conversation with Sarah Chen, Vogue's digital fashion editor, no relation despite the shared surname, as Sarah immediately clarified with a laugh, was surreal. Sarah had discovered Maya's Instagram post through the magazine's social media monitoring system, which tracked emerging trends and rising voices in fashion. "We've been watching the sustainable fashion movement gain momentum," Sarah explained over their video call, "and your post caught our attention because it perfectly encapsulates what we're seeing: young designers and fashion enthusiasts who are redefining luxury through creativity and skill rather than price tags." Sarah went on to explain that Vogue was putting together a major feature on sustainable fashion innovators, people who were proving that style wasn't about how much you spent, but about vision, creativity, and technical skill. "Your restoration work on that Comme des Garçons piece is exactly the kind of story we want to tell," Sarah continued. "The way you rescued a piece of fashion history, brought it back to life through your own skill, and then wore it with such confidence, that's what modern fashion should be about." Maya found herself speaking passionately about her philosophy, the words flowing more easily than she'd expected. She talked about growing up in her parents' alterations shop, learning to see clothes as puzzles to be solved rather than disposable commodities. She discussed the environmental impact of fast fashion, the beauty of garments with history, and the importance of valuing craftsmanship over brand recognition. "The fashion industry has convinced us that new equals better," Maya explained, gesturing enthusiastically as her nervousness faded into excitement. But some of the most beautiful, best-constructed pieces were made decades ago. When you rescue a vintage garment and restore it properly, you're not just saving it from landfills, you're preserving fashion history for future generations to study and appreciate. Sarah was taking notes throughout the conversation, asking thoughtful follow-up questions about Maya's techniques, her inspiration, and her plans for the future. The call, scheduled for 30 minutes, stretched to over an hour as they discussed everything from Japanese design philosophy to the economics of sustainable fashion. "We'd love to feature you in an upcoming digital piece," Sarah finally said. "Would you be interested in doing a photo shoot showcasing some of your restored pieces?" "We're thinking about a feature that shows the before and after of vintage restoration, with you modeling the finished pieces." Maya's yes was probably audible from several blocks away. Yep. The photo shoot was scheduled for the following week at a studio in Soho. Maya spent the intervening days in a whirlwind of preparation, curating her best pieces and carefully documenting their restoration stories. She decided to include the Comme des Garçons dress, naturally, but also a 1960s Halston she'd found at an estate sale, and restored to museum quality after discovering it had been damaged by improper dry cleaning. There was a 1980s Thierry Mugler blazer she'd reconstructed after finding it with missing buttons and a torn lining, transforming it back into the architectural masterpiece Mugler had intended. She also brought several of her own designs created from dead stock fabrics, pieces that demonstrated her original design aesthetic while maintaining her commitment to sustainability. The day of the shoot, Maya arrived at the studio with a garment bag full of her life's work and a heart full of nervous excitement. The studio was a converted warehouse space with soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. The photographer, Marcus Rodriguez, was a legend whose work Maya had studied in magazines for years. His portfolio included covers for every major fashion publication, campaigns for luxury brands, and editorial spreads that had become iconic in fashion history. Maya had expected him to be intimidating, but Marcus greeted her warmly and immediately understood her aesthetic philosophy. He examined each piece she'd brought with the eye of someone who truly appreciated craftsmanship and history. "This is incredible work," he said, carefully examining the restored Halston with a magnifying glass. "The attention to detail, the respect for the original design while bringing it back to life, this is museum-level restoration. How did you learn these techniques?" Maya found herself telling the story of her parents' alterations shop, her childhood spent watching master tailors work their magic on damaged garments. Marcus listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed his deep understanding of garment construction and textile behavior. The shoot itself was magical. Maya had been nervous about modeling. She'd always been more comfortable behind the scenes, creating rather than being the center of attention. But Marcus had a gift for making his subjects feel confident and beautiful. He captured not just the clothes, but the story behind them, the hours of careful work, the passion for fashion history, the sustainable approach to style that was both environmentally conscious and economically smart. Each shot told a complete narrative, from Maya's skilled hands working on restoration to the final, stunning result of her efforts. "The best fashion photography tells a story," Marcus explained as he adjusted his lighting setup. "These pieces have incredible stories. Your job is just to help me tell them properly." Sarah Chen conducted the interview between outfit changes, asking thoughtful questions about Maya's process, her inspirations, and her vision for the future of fashion. Maya found herself speaking more openly and confidently than she ever had before, the words flowing as easily as if she were talking to an old friend. "The fashion industry has a waste problem that's reaching crisis levels," Maya explained, as Marcus captured behind-the-scenes shots of her at work. "We're producing more clothes than ever before, but wearing them for shorter periods. Meanwhile, closets around the world are full of beautiful vintage pieces that are dismissed as outdated simply because they're not new." She demonstrated her restoration techniques on camera, showing how she researched historical construction methods and sourced period-appropriate materials. The process was painstaking and required skills that were becoming increasingly rare in an industry focused on speed and volume production. "When you rescue a vintage piece and restore it properly," Maya continued, carefully hand-stitching a demonstration repair, "you're not just creating a unique wardrobe piece, you're participating in fashion history. You're keeping alive techniques and aesthetics that might otherwise be lost. The article, titled The New Luxury Young Designers Redefining Fashion Through Sustainability, went live on Vogue.com 2 weeks later. Maya's story was the centerpiece, with stunning photographs by Marcus that elevated each restored piece to the level of art. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fashion industry professionals shared the article across social media platforms. Sustainable fashion advocates used it as evidence that style and environmental consciousness could coexist beautifully. Young designers reached out to Maya for advice on starting their own sustainable practices. But the real shock came when Sarah called Maya 3 days after the digital article went live. "Anna wants to run an expanded version in the magazine," Sarah said, barely able to contain her excitement. 6 pages in the April issue with additional pieces and a more comprehensive exploration of your philosophy. Can you come in for another shoot? And would you be available for a meeting with the senior editorial team? Maya nearly dropped her phone. Anna, as in Anna Wintour. The Anna Wintour, editor-in-chief of Vogue, the most powerful person in fashion, wanted to feature her work in the actual print magazine. The second shoot was even more elaborate than the first, held at the iconic Vogue offices at One World Trade Center. Maya found herself in the same studios where legendary fashion photographers had captured some of the most memorable images in fashion history. The Vogue team styled the looks with contemporary accessories, creating a dialogue between past and present that perfectly illustrated Maya's point about the timeless nature of true style. They paired her restored 1960s Halston with modern jewelry that echoed the dress's clean lines. The Comme des Garçons piece was styled with avant-garde accessories that emphasized its architectural qualities. Marcus was behind the camera again, but this time he was working with Vogue's full creative team: stylists, hair and makeup artists, and digital technicians who could make any vision come to life. The production value was unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. "We want to show that sustainable fashion isn't about sacrifice," explained Grace Coddington's protege, who was creative directing the shoot. "It's about making smarter choices that result in more interesting, more personal style." Between takes, Maya found herself in surreal conversations with fashion industry legends. The fashion director asked detailed questions about her restoration techniques. The accessories editor wanted to know about her sourcing methods. Even Anna Wintour herself stopped by the studio briefly, examining Maya's work with the discerning eye that had shaped fashion for decades. "Interesting approach," Anna said simply, which Maya later learned was equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. When the April issue of Vogue hit newsstands 6 weeks later, Maya's 6-page spread was stunning. Marcus's photography elevated each piece to the level of art, while the layout told the complete story of sustainable luxury and creative vision. The headline read, "Treasure Hunter: How Maya Chen is Revolutionizing Fashion One Thrift Store Find at a Time." The article explored not just Maya's restoration work, but her broader philosophy about fashion's future, sustainability, and the democratization of style. But the real moment of vindication came with the article's social media campaign. Vogue's Instagram account, with its 60 million followers, posted a series of images from Maya's shoot that became an instant sensation. Each post garnered hundreds of thousands of likes within hours, with comments flooding in from fashion enthusiasts, sustainability advocates, and industry professionals around the world. The engagement was immediate and massive. Celebrities sharing the post to their own stories, fashion editors commenting with fire emojis, and thousands of young designers tagging friends with messages like, "This is what we should all be doing." But the post that made Maya laugh until she cried was the one that changed everything. It was a close-up shot of the Comme des Garçons dress, impeccably styled and photographed against a minimalist backdrop that made it look like a piece of contemporary art. The architectural folds were highlighted by dramatic lighting, and every detail of Maya's restoration work was visible in the high-resolution image. The caption was perfectly crafted by Vogue's social media team. "When you know, you know." At Maya Stitches spotted this 1998 Comme des Garçons masterpiece at a thrift store and restored it to perfection. Her eye for fashion history and commitment to sustainability is changing how we think about luxury. Swipe to see the incredible before and after transformation that proves the best fashion stories aren't about price tags. They're about vision. hash sustainable fashion hash, vintage commodities garcons, hash fashion history hash, Rikawakabu hash, Vogue, magazine, hash sustainable luxury. The post exploded across social media like a fashion supernova, garnering over 1 million likes within 24 hours. Fashion enthusiasts shared it with their own stories about thrift store discoveries. Sustainable fashion advocates used it to promote mindful consumption and the environmental benefits of vintage shopping. Fashion students bookmarked it as inspiration, with design schools around the world incorporating Maya's story into their sustainability curricula. But what made Maya smile most were the tagged comments that began appearing within hours of the post going live. Someone had screenshotted Maya's original Instagram post from the night of the Fashion Futures Gala, that slightly defensive bathroom selfie with its pointed caption about thrift store finds, and compared it to the Vogue feature. The transformation was stark. From a young woman defending her choices in a restroom mirror to a 6-page magazine spread showcasing the same dress as a work of art worthy of museum exhibition. The glow-up is real, wrote a fashion history student, including both images in a side-by-side comparison. From thrift store mockery to Vogue magazine in 6 months. This is what happens when talent meets opportunity. At Madison Blackwell, at Sebastian Harding, at Vivian Dupont Thoughts. The call-out tag sent the post viral in fashion circles. The original screenshots were shared thousands of times, with each iteration adding more context about the Fashion Futures Gala incident. The story became legendary. The girl who wore a vintage Comme des Garçons, while rich kids mocked her thrift store shopping, only to have Vogue vindicate her vision months later. The replies that followed were a mixture of embarrassment, attempted face-saving, and outright damage control from the Trinity. Madison had posted a comment about always supporting sustainable fashion initiatives, conveniently ignoring her previous mockery. Sebastian claimed he'd never doubted the piece's authenticity and had always appreciated vintage craftsmanship. Vivian had taken a different approach, deleting most of her social media presence entirely and posting a generic statement about learning and growing from past mistakes. But the fashion world has a long memory, and screenshots are forever. The story of Maya's triumph and the Trinity's comeuppance spread through industry circles like wildfire. At fashion events, people whispered about the girl who'd worn museum-quality Comme des Garçons to a gala, while fashion school royalty mocked her for shopping secondhand. The incident became a cautionary tale about assumptions, privilege, and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. Fashion schools began using Maya's story in discussions about diversity, accessibility, and the democratization of fashion education. Dr. Warren, who had watched the entire saga unfold with academic fascination, pulled Maya aside after her next thesis meeting. "I've been in this industry for 30 years, she said. Her usually stern expression softened with something approaching pride. "I've seen careers made and destroyed over much smaller incidents. What happened to you at that gala could have broken a lesser student. Instead, you turned it into a launching pad." Maya had learned that the fashion industry was simultaneously smaller and larger than she'd imagined. Small enough that gossip traveled fast, but large enough to accommodate multiple definitions of success and style. The opportunities that followed the Vogue feature were beyond Maya's wildest dreams. Vintage fashion houses reached out about collaboration opportunities, wanting to tap into her expertise in restoration and her growing influence with younger consumers. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute contacted her about consulting on upcoming exhibitions, particularly those focusing on Japanese designers and sustainable fashion practices. Museums across the country began reaching out about restoration projects. The Fashion Institute of Technology offered her a teaching position starting after graduation. Young designers from around the world sought her mentorship in sustainable practices, and her DMs became a constant stream of before and after photos from aspiring vintage restorers. Most importantly for her immediate future, her thesis collection was suddenly the most anticipated show of the semester. What had once been student presentations attended primarily by faculty and families became industry events with buyers, editors, and established designers making special trips to see the work of fashion school graduates. Maya's collection, titled Second Life, explored the concept of fashion reincarnation through a series of pieces that combined vintage elements with contemporary design. She had deconstructed damaged vintage garments and reconstructed them into entirely new pieces that honored their histories while creating something completely fresh. The centerpiece was a gown created from three different damaged vintage dresses: a 1940s evening gown with water damage, a 1960s cocktail dress with insect holes, and a 1980s party dress with significant fading. Maya had carefully preserved the best elements of each, combining different decades of fashion history into a single garment that told the story of fashion's evolution. Fashion doesn't have to be disposable, Maya explained in her artist statement. Every garment carries the dreams and craftsmanship of its creators. When we throw clothes away, we're not just creating waste, we're discarding stories, techniques, and artistic visions that took decades to develop. The runway show itself was held in the Parsons Galleries, but the audience looked more like a Fashion Week front row than a typical student presentation. Maya spotted editors from major publications, buyers from luxury retailers, and several designers whose work she'd studied throughout school. When the first model walked out wearing Maya's reconstructed evening gown, the audience fell silent. The piece was breathtaking, clearly referencing different eras of fashion history while creating something entirely contemporary and new. The craftsmanship was impeccable, with hand-finished details that rivaled anything produced by major fashion houses. Model after model showcased Maya's vision of sustainable luxury. Each piece told a story of transformation and rebirth, proving that environmental consciousness and high fashion could not only coexist, but could enhance each other. The finale featured Maya's most personal piece, a jacket she'd created by deconstructing and reconstructing clothing from her own family's history. The base was her grandfather's vintage suit jacket, combined with silk scarves that had belonged to her grandmother, and details from her mother's traditional Chinese qipao. The result was a garment that was simultaneously deeply personal and universally appealing, honoring heritage while pointing toward the future. When Maya walked the runway after her final model, the standing ovation was thunderous and sustained. In the audience, she spotted several magazine editors taking notes, boutique owners discussing the collection with their assistants, and industry professionals who had come specifically to see her work. Dr. Warren was openly crying, something Maya had never imagined possible from her notoriously stern thesis advisor. Even some of the technical staff who had worked on the show seemed genuinely moved by what they'd witnessed. In 20 years of teaching, Dr. Warren told Maya after the show, "I've rarely seen a student create such a complete and compelling vision. You haven't just designed clothes, you've articulated a philosophy that I believe will influence the industry for years to come." The reviews were unanimous in their praise. Fashion blogs called it a masterclass in sustainable design. Industry publications described Maya as a visionary voice for fashion's future. Several pieces from the collection were immediately acquired by museums for their permanent collections. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the show, Maya received a personal note from Rei Kawakubo herself, written in careful English and delivered through Comme des Garçons' New York office. "Your restoration of my piece shows true understanding of the garment's spirit," the note read. "Your own work carries this same spirit into the future. I look forward to seeing what you create next." Maya framed the note and hung it in her studio, but she treasured even more the handwritten addition at the bottom. "P.S. The best fashion has always been about surprising people. You surprised me." 3 months after graduation, Maya opened her studio in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn's Sunset Park neighborhood. The space was split between her design atelier, where she created limited edition pieces using sustainable methods, and a carefully curated vintage boutique featuring pieces she'd restored and reimagined. She called it Second Act, a name that spoke to both the second life she gave to vintage garments and the second chances everyone deserved to define themselves on their own terms. The opening party was covered by every major fashion publication. Anna Wintour herself attended, spending an hour examining Maya's work and discussing her vision for sustainable luxury with the kind of intensity usually reserved for major designers. The image of Anna nodding approvingly while Maya explained her restoration techniques became iconic in fashion circles, symbolizing the moment when sustainable fashion moved from niche concern to mainstream necessity. But the moment Maya treasured most came when she spotted a familiar figure near the back of the crowd during the opening reception. It was Dr. Warren, beaming with pride as she watched her former student hold court with industry legends who had once seemed impossibly distant. "You remember what I told you about belonging in these spaces?" Dr. Warren said when she finally reached Maya's side, having to wait in line behind several magazine editors and boutique owners eager to speak with the evening star. Maya nodded, thinking back to that conversation during her sophomore year, when she'd felt so out of place among her wealthier classmates, when the fashion industry had seemed like an exclusive club she'd never be allowed to join. "You don't just belong in these spaces," Dr. Warren continued, her voice warm with pride and affection. "You're creating new ones. And from the looks of tonight, you're creating exactly the kind of spaces the industry needs." The studio's success exceeded every expectation Maya had dared to have. Within 6 months, she had a waiting list for custom restoration work that stretched over a year. Her original designs, created from dead stock and recycled materials, were being carried by boutiques in New York, Los Angeles, and London. Fashion magazines regularly featured her work, and she became a sought-after speaker at industry conferences about sustainability and the future of fashion. Universities invited her to give lectures on fashion history and restoration techniques. The United Nations even asked her to participate in a panel about sustainable development goals and the fashion industry's environmental impact. As the evening wound down at her one-year anniversary party, Maya found herself standing alone in her studio, surrounded by the evidence of her improbable journey. The walls were hung with magazine covers featuring her work, awards from sustainability organizations, and photographs from Fashion Week events where her designs had been worn by models and celebrities. In the corner, displayed in a place of honor under museum-quality lighting, hung the Comme des Garçons dress that had started it all. Maya walked over to touch the fabric, remembering that afternoon in Goodwill when she'd first spotted its potential hidden beneath layers of neglect and damage. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Another young designer had tagged her in a post about their own thrift store find, asking for restoration advice and sharing their excitement about discovering a piece of fashion history in an unexpected place. Maya smiled as she began typing her response, ready to pay forward the support and encouragement that had helped her transform a $15 thrift store discovery into a career that was redefining an entire industry. The message she typed had become her standard response to young designers seeking guidance. Trust your eye, respect the craft, and remember, the best fashion stories aren't about what you can afford to buy. They're about what you have the vision to see and the skill to create. Start with what you have, learn everything you can, and never let anyone convince you that passion and talent aren't worth more than connections and capital. But tonight, she added something personal. And if they laugh at your thrift store finds, just remember, Vogue might be watching. The fashion industry, she'd learned, wasn't just about what you wore. It was about having the vision to see potential where others saw only problems, the skill to transform that vision into reality, and the courage to stand by your work even when others laughed. Maya Chen had all three in abundance, and her story had become proof that the fashion world was changing, making space for voices that had previously been marginalized or ignored. 6 months later, when Maya was featured on the cover of Business of Fashion as the millennial changing fashion forever, she wore a dress she'd designed herself using deadstock silk from a factory in Queens and vintage buttons sourced from estate sales across the Northeast. But the accessories told the real story. A vintage Hermes scarf she'd found at a flea market for $20, shoes she'd restored from a 1970s designer pair discovered at where else, Goodwill, and jewelry made from repurposed vintage pieces that had been too damaged to restore completely, but too beautiful to discard. The cover story detailed her business model, her philosophy, and her growing influence on fashion's approach to sustainability. But the quote that became most famous, shared across social media and quoted in fashion schools around the world, came from the interview's final question about advice for young designers. "Some things never go out of style," Maya had said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence of someone who had proved her point against all odds. "Vision, creativity, and the courage to trust your instincts will always be in fashion, regardless of the price tag." The article's final paragraph became a rallying cry for a new generation of sustainable fashion innovators. "The most radical thing you can do in fashion isn't wearing the most expensive piece. It's wearing something with story, with history, with soul. And those things can't be bought. They have to be earned. Maya Chen had earned every stitch of her success, one thrift store find at a time. And whenever young designers reached out asking for advice about breaking into the industry without connections or capital, Maya's response was always the same. Start with what you have, trust your eye, and remember, they might laugh at your thrift store finds today, but tomorrow they'll be asking where you shop. The last line of her Business of Fashion interview had become her personal motto and the unofficial slogan of the sustainable fashion movement she'd helped create. The best revenge isn't success, it's being so successful that your critics become your biggest fans. As Maya locked up her studio that night, she reflected on how far she'd come from that humiliating moment at the Fashion Futures Gala. The Trinity, she'd heard through fashion industry gossip, had all graduated and were struggling to establish themselves in careers that their family connections had helped them access but couldn't help them excel in. Madison's family boutiques were struggling to compete with more innovative retailers who understood changing consumer preferences. Sebastian had joined his family's textile business but was reportedly clashing with leadership over their resistance to sustainable practices. Vivian had launched her own fashion line with great fanfare but poor sales, as consumers increasingly rejected brands that couldn't articulate authentic values beyond luxury for its own sake. Meanwhile, Maya's influence continued to grow. She was regularly consulted by major fashion houses looking to develop sustainable practices. Her restoration techniques were being taught in fashion schools. Her business model was being studied by entrepreneurs and academics interested in the intersection of sustainability and luxury. The $15 Comme des Garçons dress had become the most valuable piece in her collection, not because of its market value, though that had certainly increased, but because of what it represented: the power of knowledge, skill, and determination to transform not just individual garments, but entire perspectives on what fashion could and should be. Maya Chen had laughed last, and her laughter had echoed around the world.